the alternative for President Putin just at this point, which is if he were to make concessions at all. I mean, remember, in February 2022, Russian troops aimed to occupy all of Ukraine. They've lost, estimates say, 600,000 Russian soldiers. So it's not going to look very good for Putin to say, okay, we've changed all of our goals and we're going to do this. So really, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. And my feeling will be that there won't be any kind of agreement. I think it's going to drag on.
And so, if you think that Putin will have to make some kind of concession if he wants a kind of settlement sooner rather than later because of fear of it dragging on and maybe him having to launch a fresh wave of mobilization with all the political problems that entails, what might a Russian concession look like? I mean, Ukraine might need, if it's going to cede some territory, it might need a guarantee around its security, for example, NATO membership. But how would Moscow view that? And can you see any scenario in which Putin would agree to that as part of a settlement?
I really, really, really can't. I think that Putin is far more likely to be willing to make some concessions on the amount of territory that Russia would end up with than he is to make the concession of allowing Ukraine into NATO. Because, as I say, that really was kind of um, the motivation initially. Is Russia's fear of NATO, and that they and how realistic it is is another question. But they just really don't want their largest neighbor, Ukraine, to be a member of a NATO state, because then they could bring troops in. So for Russia, I think that's unacceptable. And this makes it very hard. I mean, it's interesting for both Trump, President-elect Trump, and Putin, because Trump, I don't think he's promised on day one that he's going to reach a peace agreement. But I really don't think he can afford to just sort of give away Ukraine. Even if he could force Zelensky into an agreement that would be very disadvantageous for Ukraine. He could, the scenario is he'd say, you don't get anything more from us if you don't do this. But I just am not sure that would be a win situation for Mr. Trump. But then we have the alternative for President Putin just at this point, which is if he were to make concessions at all. I mean, remember, in February 2022, Russian troops aimed to occupy all of Ukraine. They've lost, estimates say, 600,000 Russian soldiers. So it's not going to look very good for Putin to say, okay, we've changed all of our goals and we're going to do this. So really, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. And my feeling will be that there won't be any kind of agreement. I think it's going to drag on. And I think people are going to wait and see how the chips fall, what happens with, as you say, possibility, all sorts of other things. But I would not anticipate that on, day one of Trump's administration that he's going to sit down with Putin and Zelensky.
And talk to me, if you can, Amy, about some of the internal pressures that will be on Vladimir Putin at the moment when it comes to any potential negotiations. I mean, everyone's aware of the political problems when it comes to potentially a future mobilization, or indeed why it's unpalatable for him to have Ukraine in NATO. I think when you were last on Frontline, you used the term, there's a choir of discontent around Putin in the Kremlin. Would they be chiming up if he was seen to cede anything too valuable to Ukraine?
Well, when you say they, we're talking about, it's not like the elite is one, consensual group. I think the military obviously, they don't want to come out of this whole thing looking like losers. Um, but I think quite a few members of the elite, and I've talked about this before, would really just like to see an end to this war. And because I think it's pretty clear if we look back on how things have played out. This really has been Putin's war. It was his idea to invade Ukraine in 2022. And remember, he really didn't consult very many members. So this is kind of his personal project. And I do think that if he gave if he allowed some sort of concessions, the kinds of things we've been talking about, I don't think that all the members of his government, I think many members of his government would be okay with that because they want this over. I think the problem might be the military, but even they could be talked into something. I think it's really more going to be Putin's decision and his perception of how it's going to go down with the public if he does back down on all these claims. But he certainly, as of last week, didn't look like he was prepared to do that.
Do you think, Amy, there's also a risk for Vladimir Putin in the sense that he's tried very hard in recent years to cultivate a better relationship with Beijing and also with Tehran? And we have now Iranian Shahed drones being used on the front lines in Ukraine. And that, maybe, is the thing most likely to antagonize Donald Trump, this sense that Russia is building closer alliances with China and Iran. Is there a real risk there for Putin?
A real risk of antagonizing Trump or a real risk of the relations?
Yes, a risk of antagonizing Trump through his relationship.
Um, well, Trump, as we all know, is a very transactional person, and he doesn't really believe in loyalties. And or of course, people have to be personally loyal to him, but he's a quintessential opportunist. And I think I don't think Trump is looking at Putin in terms of someone that he could trust and that he wouldn't like it if Russia started to align more closely with China. I think it will all be sort of like out on the table what goes on, if I'm being clear about that. I mean, obviously, no one in the U.S. government wants to see further tightening of alignments between China, Iran, and Russia. But there are other ways of handling this that don't necessarily focus right on Ukraine, as you know.
Well, on that as well, and on Russia's burgeoning alliances with other countries, we probably should just mention a bit about North Korean troops now fighting on the side of Russia. How much significance would you place on that, Amy?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, it's a sign of that the Russian army is in a bit of trouble, right? If they have to bring all these Korean troops in, and of course, there's going to be a quid pro quo with North Korea that they have to, pony up with, and so on and so forth. It seems from everything I've read, these poor North Korean soldiers will be used just basically as cannon fodder. But I still think that it's a pretty bold step in the sense that by bringing in an outside country to have its troops in Russia and fighting against Ukraine, it's kind of a step of a little, maybe going over a red line. And that actually might incentivize the Biden administration and NATO allies to sort of step forward a little more and be a little more bold in their support of Ukraine. So I don't think it's going to help Russia that much, because from everything I've read, these troops are not very well trained, and there are going to be all sorts of logistic problems. And if anything, it's just basically going to give NATO allies further reason to maybe overstepped some lines that they weren't going to, weren't going to consider before.
Amy Knight, we always appreciate your insight and expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.